Deep in the Colorado Rockies, where cell towers fear to tread and the nearest neighbor is 20 miles of treacherous mountain road away, Harold and Martha Chen stood before a lodge they never knew existed. Their children had dumped them at a retirement home 6 months ago, claiming they were too much trouble. But a cryptic letter from a lawyer changed everything. They'd inherited property from Harold's estranged uncle, a man who'd vanished 40 years ago. What Harold didn't tell Martha was that his uncle wasn't just a hermit. He was a former CIA operative who'd discovered something that made him disappear forever. Now, as Harold traced his fingers along the lodge's seemingly innocent wood panels, he felt the familiar weight of secrets, hidden compartments, false walls. And somewhere in this wilderness fortress lay $265 million in stolen Nazi gold that 3 governments still wanted back. The question wasn't whether Harold still remembered his old intelligence training. It was whether an elderly couple could survive what was coming for them when the wrong people learned they'd found their uncle's final hideout. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Martha pulled her wool coat tighter against the mountain wind. Harold, this place gives me the creeps. Are you sure we should be here? She studied the imposing structure with its dark timber beams and windows that reflected nothing but pine trees and granite peaks. Why would your uncle leave us a place we've never even heard of? Harold's weathered hands paused on the heavy oak door. 43 years of marriage, and he'd never told her about the 5 years before they met. The years when he'd worked alongside his Uncle Thomas in places that didn't exist on any map. The agency had trained them both, but Thomas had always been the better operative. Too good, perhaps. Thomas was eccentric, Harold said, which was true enough. Maybe he thought we'd appreciate the privacy. The irony wasn't lost on him. Their children, successful, busy David in Seattle and ambitious Rebecca in Manhattan, had shipped them off to Sunset Manor like unwanted furniture. It's for your own good, David had insisted. You're both 75. What if something happens? Rebecca had nodded along, already checking her phone for the next appointment. Neither of them had visited once. Harold turned the key the lawyer had provided. The lock clicked with surprising smoothness for a building supposedly abandoned for decades. Inside, dust motes danced in shafts of afternoon sunlight, but the air didn't carry the musty staleness he'd expected. Someone had been maintaining this place. Martha stepped across the threshold, her practical shoes clicking on polished hardwood. It's beautiful, she admitted, taking in the stone fireplace that dominated one wall and the handcrafted furniture arranged as if waiting for guests. But Harold, look at this kitchen. These appliances are new, brand new. He followed her gaze to the gleaming stainless steel refrigerator and granite countertops. His pulse quickened. Thomas had always been meticulous about maintaining cover identities and safe houses, even in death, apparently. The lawyer said there was a caretaker service. Harold lied smoothly, the deception sliding off his tongue like riding a bicycle. Probably part of the estate management. Martha opened the refrigerator and gasped. It was fully stocked, fresh milk, vegetables, steaks wrapped in butcher paper. Harold, this milk expires next week. Someone was expecting us. A chill that had nothing to do with mountain air ran down Harold's spine. He moved to the window, scanning the tree line with eyes that had once spotted snipers in Beirut. Nothing moved except pine boughs swaying in the wind, but that meant little. If Thomas had left the gold here, others would know. The Odessa network had long memories. So did Moscow, and certain elements within Langley itself. Maybe we should head back to town tonight, Martha said, her voice uncertain. Get a hotel room, come back in the morning with some help to look the place over properly. No. The word came out sharper than Harold intended. Martha looked at him with surprise, and he softened his tone. I mean, we drove 4 hours to get here. Let's at least spend one night. We can drive back tomorrow if you're uncomfortable. Truth was, Harold couldn't leave, not yet. He needed to find what Thomas had hidden and determine if it was still here. The gold itself mattered less than keeping it away from the wrong hands. Blood money from the camps, stolen twice over, had a way of corrupting everything it touched. Martha nodded reluctantly and began exploring the ground floor. Harold watched her discover the library with its wall-to-wall books, the study with its antique desk, the dining room that could seat 12. She looked genuinely delighted for the first time since their children's betrayal, and something twisted in his chest. She deserved peace. After raising 2 ungrateful children and 43 years of marriage to a man who'd never told her his deepest truths, Martha Chen deserved a quiet retirement, surrounded by people who loved her. Instead, Harold had brought her to what might become their tomb. As evening shadows lengthened across the lodge, Harold began his search for Thomas's secrets. But first, he needed to check the perimeter. The coffee had grown cold in Harold's hands by the time Martha finished reading the letter aloud for the 3rd time. Each word seemed to hang in the air of their cramped apartment, defying logic and explanation. "Ezekiel Blackwood," Martha whispered, setting the heavy parchment on their small kitchen table. "I've never heard that name in my life." Harold adjusted his glasses, studying the ornate letterhead with its embossed eagle and mountain peaks. The paper felt expensive between his weathered fingers, nothing like the thin notices they usually received from creditors or the city housing authority. "Says here he was your great-uncle on your mother's side." Harold traced the elegant script with his index finger. "Blackwood Mountain Lodge, established 1923. Sounds fancy." Martha shook her head slowly. "Mother never mentioned any relatives. After Daddy died, she always said we were alone in the world." Her voice carried the weight of old grief, memories of a childhood marked by poverty and isolation. The lawyer's business card was equally puzzling. Thornfield, Webb and Associates operated from an address in the mountains, 3 hours' drive from the city. Harold had never heard of the town, Millbrook, despite living in the region his entire 74 years. "Could be a scam," Harold said, though his tone suggested he didn't quite believe it. "Those criminals are getting sophisticated these days. With handmade paper and wax seals." Martha picked up the envelope again, examining the postmark. "This came through regular mail, Harold. Cost someone serious money to produce." The inheritance seemed too good to be true, especially considering their current circumstances. Their children, grown adults with families of their own, had made their feelings clear during last month's awkward dinner. "You're becoming a burden," their daughter Susan had said with characteristic bluntness. "Maybe it's time to consider your options." Their options, as it turned out, were limited. Harold's pension barely covered rent on their 1-bedroom apartment, and Martha's Social Security check disappeared into medical bills and groceries. The assisted living facility their son David recommended cost more per month than they'd ever earned. "We should call this lawyer," Martha said suddenly, surprising herself with the decisiveness in her voice. Harold raised an eyebrow. "You sure about that? Could be opening a can of worms?" But Martha was already reaching for their old rotary phone, the brass numbers worn smooth from decades of use. The number connected after several rings, and a crisp female voice answered. "Thornfield, Webb and Associates, how may I direct your call? This is Martha Whitmore. I received a letter about an inheritance?" "Mrs. Whitmore, yes. Mr. Thornfield has been expecting your call. Please hold." The brief wait stretched into eternity. Harold moved closer, pressing his ear near the receiver to listen. Classical music played softly through the line, interrupted by the occasional crackle of static. "Mrs. Whitmore?" The voice that came on was deep, authoritative, with just a hint of mountain accent. "This is Samuel Thornfield. I trust you received our correspondence regarding your great-uncle's estate?" "I did, but I'm afraid there's been some mistake. I don't have any great-uncles." "I understand your confusion. Ezekiel was quite reclusive, and there was some family discord decades ago. Perhaps your mother chose not to discuss certain relatives." Thornfield's tone was patient, almost paternal. "I have extensive documentation proving the relationship if you'd like to review it." Martha glanced at Harold, who nodded encouragingly. "What exactly did my great-uncle leave me?" the Blackwood Mountain Lodge and surrounding property, approximately 300 acres of prime mountain real estate, plus the contents of the lodge itself. I should mention, Mrs. Whitmore, that this is quite a substantial inheritance. The property alone is worth several $1,000,000. The phone nearly slipped from Martha's grasp. Harold caught her elbow, steadying her against the kitchen counter. "Several million?" she managed. "Indeed. However, there are certain conditions attached to the inheritance as outlined in Mr. Blackwood's will. Nothing onerous, I assure you, but they do require your personal presence here in Millbrook to complete the transfer." Martha's mind raced. Millions of dollars, enough to secure their future, maybe even help their ungrateful children despite their recent coldness. "When would we need to come?" "At your earliest convenience. The estate has been in probate for some time, and there are other interested parties who might contest the will if we delay much longer." Something in Thornfield's tone sent a chill down Martha's spine. "Other parties?" "Nothing to concern yourself with, Mrs. Whitmore. Simply legal formalities. Shall we say tomorrow afternoon? I can arrange accommodations at the lodge itself." After hanging up, Martha and Harold sat in silence for several minutes. Outside their apartment window, the city hummed with its usual chaos of traffic and voices, but inside their small kitchen, possibility hung thick as mountain fog. "Tomorrow," Harold said finally. "Tomorrow," Martha agreed, though neither could shake the feeling that they were stepping into something far more complex than a simple inheritance. The morning after receiving the inheritance letter, Martha stood at their kitchen window watching Harold rake the same pile of leaves for the third time. His movements were methodical but purposeless, the way he'd been doing everything since their son David had suggested they consider their options regarding senior living facilities. "You're going to wear a hole in those leaves," she called through the screen door. Harold paused, leaning heavily on the rake handle. At 73, he still had the broad shoulders of the construction foreman he'd once been, but lately those shoulders carried an invisible weight that seemed to grow heavier each day. "Better than wearing a hole in the carpet," he replied, though his heart wasn't in the joke. Martha dried her hands on the dish towel and stepped outside. The October air carried the scent of wood smoke from their neighbor's chimney, a smell that usually comforted her, but today only emphasized how alone they'd become. The Hendersons had moved to Florida last spring. The Kowalskis had passed within 6 months of each other the previous winter. One by one, their neighborhood was emptying of familiar faces. "I've been thinking about that letter," she said, settling onto the porch steps. Harold's rake stilled completely. They'd barely spoken of Ezra Blackwood's inheritance since yesterday, though Martha had caught Harold reading and rereading the lawyer's letter at the kitchen table after he thought she'd gone to sleep. "What about it? When's the last time anything exciting happened to us? Real exciting, I mean. Not just Susan calling to tell us about Emma's soccer tournament we can't attend because it's too far to drive." Harold abandoned the rake and joined her on the steps. His knees creaked as he sat, a sound they'd both learned to ignore. "Exciting isn't always good at our age, Martha. Exciting usually means the hospital or bad news about the roof." She laughed, surprising them both. "Harold Eugene Morrison, when did you become such an old man?" "When my children started looking at me like I was already dead." The words hung between them, sharp and honest. Martha reached for his weathered hand, noting how the wedding ring he'd worn for 51 years now slipped loose on his finger. "David thinks he's protecting us," she said softly. "David thinks we're liabilities. There's a difference." Martha couldn't argue with that. Their son's last visit had been punctuated by pointed observations about their declining capabilities. Harold's occasional forgetfulness, Martha's arthritis, their mutual reluctance to embrace technology that would keep them connected. As if connection was something that could be downloaded. "So what harm could there be in taking a drive?" she asked. "Pine Ridge is only 3 hours north. We could make it a day trip." Harold studied her face, seeing something there he hadn't glimpsed in months. "You really want to do this?" "I want to remember what it feels like to be curious about something." to have a mystery to solve. She gestured toward their tidy yard, their quiet street, their predictable life. This is lovely, Harold, but it's not living, it's just waiting. The truth of that statement settled over them like morning mist. They had been waiting for grandchildren to visit, for holidays that brought obligatory phone calls, for the inevitable decline that everyone seemed to expect from them. Harold pulled the letter from his shirt pocket. The paper was already soft from handling. Ezra Blackwood, he read aloud. Why would someone we've never heard of leave us anything? Maybe we have heard of him, but we've forgotten. Or maybe he's connected to someone we knew years ago. Martha's voice gained energy as possibilities multiplied. Remember when your father used to tell those stories about his army days, all those names and places that meant nothing to us then? Harold nodded slowly. His father had died when Harold was barely 30, taking with him decades of stories that Harold had been too young and too busy building his own life to fully appreciate. It could be connected to anything, Martha continued. Your family, my family, someone we worked with, someone we helped. She stood, brushing off her slacks with sudden determination. We won't know unless we go. Harold looked up at his wife of 51 years, seeing the spark in her eyes that had first attracted him to her at a church dance in 1952. She'd worn a blue dress that brought out her eyes, and when she'd smiled at him across the room, he'd known his life was about to change forever. When do you want to leave? He asked. Martha's smile was radiant. How about right now? Harold chuckled, but as he stood and pocketed the letter, he realized she wasn't entirely joking. For the first time in months, they had somewhere to be that mattered to no one but themselves. Let me get my jacket, he said. The wind howled through the pine trees as Harold gripped the steering wheel tighter, navigating another hairpin turn on the mountain road. Martha clutched the inheritance papers in her lap, the yellowed documents rustling with each bump in the deteriorating asphalt. This can't be right, she muttered, squinting at the hand-drawn map that had accompanied the legal documents. According to this, we should have reached the lodge 20 minutes ago. Harold slowed the car as fog began to roll across their path, reducing visibility to mere yards ahead. Maybe we missed a turn. These mountain roads all look the same to me. They'd been driving for 3 hours since leaving the lawyer's office in Denver, each mile taking them further from civilization and deeper into the Colorado Rockies. The inheritance had come as a complete shock, a mountain lodge and substantial property left to Martha by a great-aunt she barely remembered. Edith Blackwood had been the family's black sheep, the one who disappeared into the mountains decades ago and was rarely spoken of at family gatherings. There, Martha pointed through the windshield. I see something. Through the mist, a weathered wooden sign emerged. Blackwood Lodge, private property. Below it, in smaller letters that had been recently painted over older text, read no trespassing. Harold turned onto the narrow gravel drive, their sedan bouncing over deep ruts carved by years of mountain weather. Ancient pines pressed close on both sides, their branches scraping against the car windows like gnarled fingers. The temperature had dropped noticeably since they'd begun their ascent, and Martha pulled her cardigan tighter around her shoulders. The lodge materialized from the fog like something from another era. 3 stories of dark timber and stone rose before them, with a wraparound porch supported by massive log pillars. Despite its age, the structure appeared remarkably well maintained, as if someone had been caring for it recently. It's bigger than I expected, Harold said, parking beside a stack of split firewood that looked freshly cut. They approached the front door cautiously, their footsteps echoing on the wooden porch. Martha fumbled with the ornate brass key the lawyer had given her, surprised when it turned easily in the lock. The heavy door swung open with barely a creak. The interior took their breath away. The main room soared 2 stories high, dominated by a massive stone fireplace with embers still glowing faintly in the grate. Rich Persian rugs covered polished hardwood floors, and the walls were lined with built-in bookcases filled with leather-bound volumes. Everything was spotless, as if the lodge had been expecting their arrival. Someone's been here recently, Martha whispered, noting the fresh flowers in a crystal vase on the mantelpiece. Harold nodded toward the kitchen, where they could see clean dishes drying beside the sink. Very recently. A sound from upstairs made them both freeze, a soft thud, like footsteps or furniture being moved. They looked at each other, Harold reaching protectively for Martha's arm. "Hello?" Martha called out, her voice echoing in the vast space. "Is someone there?" Silence. Harold spotted a poker beside the fireplace and picked it up, feeling somewhat foolish but comforted by its weight. Together they climbed the curved staircase, the wooden steps solid beneath their feet despite the lodge's obvious age. The second-floor hallway stretched in both directions, lined with closed doors. Family portraits hung along the walls, stern-faced men and women in clothing spanning several decades. Martha paused before one photograph showing a woman who bore a striking resemblance to herself, though dressed in 1940s attire. "That must be Aunt Edith," she breathed. The photo was labeled in elegant script, "Edith Blackwood, 1947. But what caught Martha's attention was what the woman wore around her neck, an elaborate necklace that seemed to match something she'd glimpsed in the inheritance documents. Another sound came from behind a door at the end of the hall, definitely footsteps this time. Harold raised the poker as they approached, his heart hammering against his ribs. The door was slightly ajar, revealing a slice of what appeared to be an office or study. Harold pushed the door open slowly, poker raised. The room was empty, but clearly someone had been there moments before. Papers were scattered across a large oak desk, and a chair was still spinning slightly, as if someone had just vacated it. Through the window, they caught a glimpse of movement in the tree line, a figure in dark clothing disappearing into the forest. On the desk, a single sheet of paper remained, with words written in fresh ink. "You shouldn't have come here. Some inheritances come with a price too dangerous to pay. Leave now while you still can." Martha sank into the abandoned chair, her hands trembling as she held the warning. Outside, the wind picked up, causing the lodge to creak ominously around them. Whatever secrets Aunt Edith had left behind, it was clear that others knew about them, and were willing to go to great lengths to protect them. The mountain road twisted like a serpent's spine, each hairpin turn revealing glimpses of the valley far below. Martha gripped the passenger door handle as Harold navigated their aging sedan up the treacherous incline, the engine whining in protest against the steep grade. "Are you certain this is right?" Martha asked, studying the hand-drawn map they'd found tucked inside Augustus Blackwood's letter. The paper was yellowed with age, its edges brittle as autumn leaves. Harold squinted through the windshield at the dense wall of pine trees. "According to this, we should reach the lodge within the next mile." His voice carried more confidence than he felt. The last sign of civilization had been a rusted mailbox 20 minutes ago. The road narrowed further, forcing Harold to slow to a crawl. Branches scraped against the car's sides like skeletal fingers. Martha shivered despite the afternoon warmth, pulling her cardigan tighter around her shoulders. Something about this place felt wrong, as if they were intruding on a secret the mountains had kept for decades. There, Harold pointed ahead, where the trees parted like curtains. "I see something." The Blackwood Lodge emerged from the wilderness like a scene from a Gothic novel. 3 stories of dark timber and stone rose against the mountainside, its peaked roofs and wraparound porches suggesting former grandeur now touched by decay. Tall windows stared down at them like hollow eyes, their glass reflecting the late afternoon sun in ways that seemed almost accusatory. Harold parked beside a rusted pickup truck that looked abandoned. The silence after he turned off the engine was profound, broken only by the whisper of wind through pine needles and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. "Someone else is here," Martha observed, nodding toward the truck. Her voice was barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might awaken something better left sleeping. They approached the lodge's front entrance, their footsteps echoing on the weathered planks of the porch. The massive wooden door bore intricate carvings of ravens and thorny vines, details that spoke of craftsmanship from another era. Harold raised his hand to knock, but the door swung open before his knuckles could make contact. "You must be the Weatherbys." The woman standing in the doorway was perhaps 60, with silver hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes the color of winter sky. She wore a simple black dress that gave her the appearance of a housekeeper or caretaker. "I'm Eleanor Thorne. I've been expecting you." Martha exchanged a glance with Harold. "Expecting us?" "Mr. Blackwood left very specific instructions regarding your arrival. Please, come in from the cold." The lodge's interior was a study in contrasts. Rich mahogany paneling and crystal chandeliers spoke of wealth and sophistication, yet dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight streaming through grimy windows. Persian rugs covered polished hardwood floors, but the air held the musty scent of a place long closed to fresh air and human warmth. Eleanor led them through a great room dominated by a massive stone fireplace. Above the mantel hung a portrait of a distinguished man with penetrating dark eyes and a neatly trimmed beard. Even in oils on canvas, his gaze seemed to follow their movement across the room. "Augustus Blackwood," Eleanor said, noticing their attention. "Painted in 1987, just 2 years before his disappearance." "Disappearance?" Harold stopped walking. The letter mentioned his death. Eleanor's smile was thin as paper. "Mr. Blackwood was declared dead 7 years after he vanished from this very lodge. His body was never found." She gestured toward a seating area arranged before tall windows that offered a breathtaking view of the valley below. "Please sit. There's much you need to understand about your inheritance." Martha settled onto a leather sofa that had probably cost more than their car. "How did you know we were coming? We only decided to make this trip yesterday." Mr. Blackwood was a man who planned for every contingency. He knew that eventually someone would respond to the letters his estate has been sending for years. Eleanor moved to a sideboard and poured 3 glasses of amber liquid from a crystal decanter. "Brandy? You'll need it for what I'm about to tell you." Harold accepted the glass, noting how Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she served them. "What exactly are you telling us, Miss Thorne?" "Mrs. Thorne," she corrected, settling into a wing-back chair across from them. "And what I'm telling you is that your great-uncle Augustus discovered something in these mountains, something that certain people would kill to possess." Her voice dropped to barely audible, "something that has already cost several lives, including quite possibly his own." Thunder rumbled in the distance, though the sky had been clear when they arrived. Eleanor glanced toward the windows with obvious unease. "The weather changes quickly up here," she murmured. "Sometimes it feels like the mountain itself is angry." She turned back to them, her expression grave. "Before we go any further, I need to ask you both a question, and I need you to answer honestly. Are you prepared to learn the truth about why you're really here?" The silence in the lodge stretched on as Harold stared at the photograph, his weathered hands trembling slightly. Martha moved closer, peering over his shoulder at the black and white image of a young woman who bore an unmistakable resemblance to Harold's jawline and Martha's eyes. "That's impossible," Martha whispered. "Harold, you never mentioned having a sister." "'Cause I didn't know." His voice was barely audible. "My parents, they told me I was their only child. But this woman, she has our wedding photo on her mantel." Martha took the photograph from his hands, studying it more carefully. Behind the young woman, barely visible in the background, stood a man in a military uniform. The photo's edges were yellowed with age, suggesting it was taken decades ago. "Look at the back," Harold said, his voice gaining strength. Martha flipped the photograph over. In faded blue ink, someone had written, "Eleanor Whitmore, 1952. The truth must be protected." "Whitmore," Martha repeated. "That's your mother's maiden name." Before Harold could respond, a sharp crack echoed through the lodge. They both froze, listening intently. Another crack, then the unmistakable sound of footsteps on the wooden porch outside. Harold grabbed Martha's arm and pulled her away from the window. "Someone's here," he mouthed silently. They crept toward the back of the lodge, Harold clutching the photograph and the letter that had brought them here. The footsteps grew louder, more deliberate. Whoever was outside wasn't trying to be quiet anymore. Martha spotted a narrow hallway leading toward what appeared to be a kitchen. She tugged Harold's sleeve, pointing in that direction. They moved carefully, avoiding the floorboards that had creaked under their weight earlier. From the kitchen window, they could see a black SUV parked behind their rental car, effectively blocking their escape route. Two men in dark coats stood near the vehicles, while the footsteps on the porch suggested at least one more person at the front entrance. "How did they find us so quickly?" Martha whispered, her heart pounding. Harold shook his head, but his expression was grim. "The same way they found Eleanor, I'd guess." A loud bang came from the front door, followed by the sound of splintering wood. The men weren't bothering with subtlety now. "Is there a back door?" Harold asked, scanning the kitchen. Martha pointed to a door beside the refrigerator. Harold tried the handle, locked, but the key hung on a nearby hook. His hands shook as he turned the lock, the mechanism seeming impossibly loud in the tense silence. Heavy footsteps echoed through the main room of the lodge. A gruff voice called out, "We know you're in here. Make this easy on yourselves." Harold eased the back door open, just wide enough for them to slip through. The cold mountain air hit them like a slap, but they didn't dare pause. Behind the lodge, a steep slope covered in pine trees offered their only chance of concealment. They made it perhaps 50 yards into the tree line before Harold stumbled, his breathing labored. Martha helped him steady himself against a large pine trunk. "I can't. Need a moment," he gasped. Martha looked back toward the lodge. Through the windows, she could see flashlight beams moving systematically through the rooms. "They're searching the place thoroughly," she observed. "They're looking for the same thing we were," Harold said, catching his breath. "Something Eleanor hid there. But what? And why is it worth killing for?" Harold pulled the photograph from his coat pocket, studying it again in the dim moonlight filtering through the trees. Eleanor Whitmore, 1952. The truth must be protected. He looked up at Martha. "What if the fortune mentioned in the inheritance letter isn't just money?" A shout came from the direction of the lodge. The men had discovered the unlocked back door. "We need to move," Martha urged. They began working their way deeper into the forest, using the thick tree trunks for cover. The slope was treacherous in the darkness, loose rocks and hidden roots threatening to send them tumbling with each step. Behind them, flashlight beams began sweeping through the trees. The men were following their trail. There, Harold pointed to a rocky outcropping about 100 yards ahead. "We can hide behind those boulders." They reached the rocks just as voices became audible behind them. Two men, maybe three, moving through the forest with practiced efficiency. Crouched behind the cold stone, Martha noticed something odd. The rocks weren't naturally formed. They showed signs of deliberate placement. Looking closer in the moonlight, she could make out what appeared to be the foundation of an old structure. Harold was examining something carved into the largest boulder. Even in the dim light, the symbol was clear. The same mountain peak design that had been embossed on the envelope containing their inheritance letter. "Martha," he whispered urgently, "I think we found what Eleanor was trying to protect." The voices were getting closer. The morning mist clung to the mountainside like ghostly fingers as Harold helped Martha down the treacherous path behind the lodge. Her ankle, still tender from yesterday's fall, made each step precarious on the dew-slicked rocks. They had waited until dawn, watching through their window as the black sedan finally disappeared down the mountain road. "There," Martha whispered, pointing to a grove of ancient pines where the morning light barely penetrated. Edgar's letter said to look for the lightning-struck oak among the evergreens. Harold squinted through his bifocals. Sure enough, a massive oak stood sentinel among the pines, its trunk split and scarred by some long-ago storm. As they approached, Martha pulled the crumpled letter from her coat pocket, reading Edgar's spidery handwriting for the dozenth time. 30 paces north from the oak's base," she murmured. "Then look for the stone that doesn't belong." Harold counted off the steps while Martha scanned the ground. The forest floor was carpeted with pine needles and moss-covered boulders, everything looking perfectly natural until Harold, here. Martha knelt beside what appeared to be just another rock, but as Harold looked closer, he could see it was too perfectly round, too deliberately placed. Together they managed to roll it aside, revealing a metal box wrapped in oilcloth. Inside the box, Martha's fingers trembled as she lifted out a thick manila envelope and what looked like an old brass key. The envelope contained photographs that made Harold's stomach lurch, images of men in expensive suits shaking hands with uniformed officials, briefcases of cash changing hands, and documents stamped with government seals. "My God," Martha breathed, studying one photograph closely. "Look at the date on this, 1963, and this man here," she pointed to a figure in the background. "I've seen his face before, in the newspapers." Harold examined the photo. Even decades younger, the man's cold eyes were unmistakable. Senator Richardson, who had died just last year amid whispers of corruption scandals that never quite stuck. In the photo, he was clearly accepting an envelope from someone Harold didn't recognize. Edgar wasn't just wealthy, Harold realized, pieces clicking together. He was a blackmailer. A note tucked between the photographs confirmed his suspicion. "Insurance for my insurance," it read in Edgar's familiar scrawl. "The families involved have built empires on dirty money. They've been paying me to keep quiet for 40 years. Now it's your turn to choose. Take the money and run, or expose them all. But beware, they've killed to protect these secrets before." Martha's face had gone pale. "Harold, what have we gotten ourselves into?" Before he could answer, the sound of vehicles echoing up from the lodge made them both freeze. Through the trees, they could see not one but 3 black cars pulling up the gravel drive. "We need to move," Harold said, quickly stuffing the contents back into the envelope. "Now." But as they turned to head deeper into the forest, Martha gasped. "The key, Harold. Edgar mentioned a safe in the lodge basement." "What if there's more?" "Are you insane? Those people down there aren't here for a friendly chat. But this might be our only chance. If we run now, we'll never know what Edgar really left us. And those men, they'll tear that lodge apart looking for whatever we just found. They might destroy evidence that could bring down an entire network of corruption." Harold looked at his wife of 52 years, seeing the same determination that had carried her through raising their children, surviving his heart attack, enduring their family's abandonment. She was right, and he knew it. The back entrance, he decided, through the old root cellar. They crept back toward the lodge, using the tree line for cover. The men from the cars had spread out, some heading inside while others positioned themselves around the perimeter. Harold counted at least 8, all wearing dark suits despite the mountain setting. The root cellar door was overgrown with vines, exactly as Edgar had described in one of his letters. Harold pulled it open, wincing at the rusty hinges squeal. The narrow stairs led down into musty darkness, and Martha fumbled for the small flashlight she'd brought. The basement was larger than expected, filled with old furniture and boxes that looked untouched for decades. But in the far corner, behind a stack of steamer trunks, Martha's flashlight beam caught the gleam of metal. The safe was built into the stone foundation itself, its face bearing the same ornate design as the brass key they'd found. Harold's hands shook as he inserted the key, and with a solid click, the heavy door swung open. Inside were stacks of cash, more photographs, and something that made Martha gasp. Birth certificates, death certificates, and adoption papers spanning decades. Names they recognized from newspapers and television, all connected by a web of falsified documents. Above them, footsteps thundered across the lodge's main floor, and voices shouted commands. They were running out of time, but what they'd discovered would change everything, if they lived long enough to use it. The silence in the lodge felt different now, charged with menace rather than mere emptiness. Harold's hands trembled as he sorted through the photographs scattered across the dining table, each image a window into a conspiracy that stretched back decades. Martha stood beside him, her face pale in the lamplight, clutching a manila folder they'd found hidden behind a loose floorboard. "Look at this one," she whispered, pointing to a black-and-white photograph dated 1987. It showed a group of men in expensive suits, standing outside what appeared to be a mining operation. Harold recognized the mountains in the background. They were the same peaks visible from the lodge's windows. "That's Senator Morrison," Harold said, squinting at a younger version of the politician who'd been making headlines recently for his environmental legislation. "And isn't that—" "Thomas Brennan," Martha finished, "before he became the CEO of Brennan Industries." She flipped through more photos. "Harold, these men, they're all powerful now. Senators, CEOs, judges." Harold picked up a yellow document from the folder. The letterhead read Mountain Vista Mining Consortium, and the signature at the bottom made his blood run cold. It was his uncle's name, but the handwriting looked forced, unnatural. "They made him sign this," Harold said, his voice hollow. "Uncle Edmund discovered something up here, something valuable, and they forced him to sign over the mineral rights." Martha's fingers traced over a geological survey map. Red circles marked specific areas of the mountain, with notes scribbled in the margins about unprecedented deposits and potential for unlimited extraction. The dates on the surveys showed they'd been conducted just months before Edmund's supposed accident. A floorboard creaked somewhere in the lodge. They both froze, listening intently. The wind had died down outside, making every sound sharp and distinct. "We should go," Martha whispered. "Take these documents and leave." Harold was about to agree when he noticed something else in the folder, a handwritten letter on Edmund's personal stationery. The writing was shaky, but clearly his uncle's. "Martha, listen to this," Harold read quietly. "If you're reading this, then they've finally silenced me. The truth about what lies beneath this mountain must not die with me. Check the old mine shaft behind the lodge. The evidence is there, hidden where they'll never think to look. Trust no one in uniform. The corruption reaches everywhere." The sound came again, closer this time. Definitely footsteps on the lodge's wraparound porch. Martha quickly gathered the photographs while Harold stuffed the documents back into the folder. They'd left their car parked openly in front of the lodge, a clear sign of their presence. "The back door," Harold whispered urgently. They moved through the lodge's dim interior, their footsteps muffled by decades-old carpeting. Behind them, they heard the distinct sound of the front door's handle being tested. Then came a soft scraping noise, someone picking the lock. Harold's heart hammered against his ribs as they reached the kitchen. Through the back window, he could see the tree line where the old mine shaft supposedly waited. The moon had emerged from behind the clouds, casting everything in silver light that would make them visible the moment they stepped outside. "There's no choice," Martha breathed. Harold opened the back door as quietly as possible. The hinges protested with a soft squeal that seemed impossibly loud in the mountain air. They slipped outside and immediately heard voices from inside the lodge. At least 2 men, maybe 3. "They were here recently," one voice said. "The dust's been disturbed. Find everything. We can't let this get out." Harold and Martha crept along the lodge's back wall, using the shadows for cover. The mine shaft Edmund had mentioned was supposedly about 100 yards into the forest. In daylight, it would be a simple walk. In the darkness, with unknown pursuers behind them, every step felt like a gamble. They reached the tree line just as a flashlight beam swept across the lodge's rear windows. Harold pulled Martha behind a thick pine tree, both of them breathing hard from adrenaline and exertion. The forest floor was soft with decades of fallen needles, muffling their movement but making footing treacherous. "This way," Harold whispered, remembering childhood explorations of these woods with Edmund as his guide. They pushed deeper into the forest, guided by moonlight filtering through the canopy. Behind them, the flashlight beams had moved outside, sweeping back and forth in systematic search patterns. These weren't casual thieves or curious locals. These were professionals who knew exactly what they were looking for. The mine shaft appeared suddenly, a dark mouth in the earth partially concealed by overgrown vegetation. Harold knelt beside it, peering into the blackness while Martha kept watch behind them. "I can see something down there," he whispered. "Some kind of container." The flashlights were getting closer, their beams dancing through the trees like malevolent fireflies. Whatever secrets Edmund had hidden in that mine shaft, they were about to either save Harold and Martha's lives or seal their fate forever. The cellar's stone walls pressed in around them as Harold's flashlight beam swept across row upon row of filing cabinets. The musty air carried the weight of decades, and Martha could taste the metallic tang of fear on her tongue. Above them, the lodge remained silent, but that silence felt more ominous than any noise would have. "Look at this," Harold whispered, pulling open the nearest drawer. Manila folders packed tight as sardines filled the space, each one labeled with dates stretching back to the 1960s. He pulled one out at random, 1987, and opened it to reveal photographs, documents, and what appeared to be financial records. Martha peered over his shoulder, squinting at a black and white photograph of men in expensive suits shaking hands outside what looked like a government building. "That's Senator Morrison," she breathed, recognizing the face from old newspapers. "But he died in that car accident years ago." According to this, it wasn't an accident. Harold's finger traced a typed report detailing brake line tampering and a payment of $50,000 to someone identified only as the cleaner. His hand trembled slightly as he turned the page to reveal more photographs. Morrison's mangled car crime scene shots that had never been released to the public. A board creaked overhead and they both froze. The sound came again, deliberate footsteps moving across the main floor. Martha grabbed Harold's arm, her nails digging into his sleeve. They listened as the steps paused, then changed direction, heading toward the kitchen where the cellar entrance lay hidden behind the pantry door. Harold quickly rifled through more files while they still could. Each folder revealed another layer of corruption: judges bought, elections rigged, witnesses who had disappeared without a trace. The scope was staggering. This wasn't just local political maneuvering, it was a shadow organization that had been pulling strings at the highest levels of government for over half a century. "Harold," Martha hissed, pointing to a folder marked with a familiar name, Blackwood Industries. Inside were contracts, offshore banking records, and correspondence signed with the same elegant handwriting they'd seen on their inheritance documents. But these papers painted a different picture entirely: arms dealing, human trafficking, environmental cover-ups that had poisoned entire communities. The footsteps above grew closer, accompanied now by voices, at least two people, maybe three. Harold couldn't make out the words, but the tone was businesslike, efficient. These weren't random intruders stumbling around in the dark. "We need to get out of here," Martha whispered, but Harold was already pulling out his phone, frantically photographing page after page. The camera flash seemed impossibly bright in the darkness, and Martha was certain it would give them away, but Harold kept shooting. A photograph slipped from one of the files and fluttered to the floor. Martha bent to retrieve it, and her blood turned to ice. It was a recent photo, taken with a telephoto lens, showing her and Harold walking out of their lawyer's office just 3 days ago. Someone had been watching them from the very beginning. The pantry door creaked open above them, and a thin sliver of light cut through the darkness at the top of the cellar stairs. Harold snapped his phone shut and grabbed Martha's hand. There had to be another way out. Old root cellars like this often had multiple exits. They crept deeper into the filing room, Harold's flashlight beam dancing frantically across the walls. Behind them, heavy boots descended the wooden steps with measured precision. No attempt at stealth now. Whoever it was knew they were down here. "In here," Harold whispered, spotting a low archway partially hidden behind the last row of filing cabinets. They squeezed through into a narrow tunnel that smelled of earth and decay. Martha's claustrophobia clawed at her chest, but the sound of files being scattered behind them kept her moving forward. The tunnel seemed to stretch forever, carved roughly from the mountain stone. Harold's flashlight began to dim, the beam growing weaker with each step. Just when Martha thought she might scream from the crushing darkness, they emerged into another chamber. This one was different, older, with symbols carved into the walls that looked almost ritualistic. In the center sat an ornate wooden chest, its brass fittings green with age. Harold approached it carefully, as if it might explode, and lifted the heavy lid. Inside, wrapped in oiled leather, were more documents. But these weren't modern files. They were handwritten ledgers dating back over a century, filled with names and numbers in various currencies. At the bottom of the chest lay a single leather journal bound with a brass clasp. Harold opened it to the first page and read aloud in a barely audible whisper, "The true history of the Blackwood legacy, as recorded by those who refused to be silenced." Behind them, the sound of pursuit grew closer. Someone had found the tunnel entrance. Martha looked at the journal in Harold's hands and realized they weren't just inheriting money or property, they were inheriting a war that had been raging in the shadows for generations. And now, they were on the front lines. The storm had passed, leaving the mountain lodge eerily quiet, except for the steady drip of melting snow from the eaves. Harold pressed his face against the frosted window, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. The men who had surrounded them the night before seemed to have vanished with the darkness, but he knew better than to trust the apparent calm. Martha sat at the kitchen table, the leather journal open before her, her reading glasses perched on the end of her nose. She'd been poring over the pages since dawn, piecing together fragments of a story that grew more disturbing with each revelation. The neat handwriting belonged to Harold's great-uncle Edgar, documenting transactions that dated back 40 years. "Listen to this," Martha said, her voice barely above a whisper. "August 15th, 1983. Payment received from Blackwood Industries, $50,000 for maintaining silence regarding the Copper Creek incident. They think money will keep me quiet forever, but I'm documenting everything. The families of those workers deserve to know the truth." Harold turned from the window, his weathered face grim. "Copper Creek. I remember that from the news when I was young. Mine collapse, wasn't it? Killed a dozen men." "According to Edgar, it wasn't an accident." Martha's finger traced the lines of text. Blackwood knew the supports were failing. They had geological reports warning of instability, but they kept the mine operational to meet a crucial contract deadline. When it collapsed, they paid Edgar to stay quiet about the reports he'd helped prepare. The implications settled between them like a weight. Harold moved to the table and sat heavily beside his wife. "So that's what this inheritance really is. Blood money." Martha turned the page, revealing a hand-drawn map of the lodge property. Red X marks dotted various locations around the building and grounds. Edgar didn't just take their money and stay quiet. Look at this. He was collecting evidence, hiding it all over this property. Bank records, photographs, internal memos from Blackwood Industries. A sudden creak from the front porch made them both freeze. Harold reached for the poker from the fireplace, his arthritic hands gripping the iron rod. The sound came again, deliberate footsteps approaching the door. 3 sharp knocks echoed through the lodge. "Mr. and Mrs. Peterson?" The voice was female, crisp and professional. "My name is Detective Sarah Chen with the State Police. I'd like to speak with you about Edgar Whitmore's property." Harold and Martha exchanged glances. After their encounter with the armed men, trust didn't come easily. "Show us some identification," Harold called through the door. A badge appeared at the window beside the door, held steady for their inspection. Detective Chen was younger than their own children, with short black hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. Harold cautiously opened the door, keeping the poker within reach. "We've had reports of suspicious activity in this area," Chen said, stepping inside. "Armed men, possible break-ins. Are you folks all right?" "Depends on who's asking," Martha replied, closing the journal but keeping her hand on it. "And why the state police are interested in a simple inheritance matter." Chen's expression shifted, becoming more serious. "Because Edgar Whitmore's death wasn't as natural as everyone assumed. We've been investigating connections between his research work and several unsolved cases dating back decades. When we learned he'd left property to relatives, we knew it was only a matter of time before the vultures circled." She gestured toward the journal. I'm guessing you found some of his documentation. Harold studied the detective's face, searching for deception. 40 years of managing people had taught him to read the subtle signs of truth and lies. What he saw in Chen's eyes was determination and something else, a hunger for justice that reminded him of his younger self. "Show us your warrant," Martha said firmly. Chen smiled, the first genuine warmth she'd displayed. "Smart woman. I don't have one because this isn't an official investigation yet. Officially, Edgar Whitmore died of natural causes and left his property to distant relatives. Unofficially, I've been tracking a pattern of deaths and disappearances connected to people who worked for Blackwood Industries in the 1980s. She pulled out a tablet and showed them a series of newspaper clippings and police reports. 12 deaths over the past 20 years, all ruled accidents or natural causes, all involving people who had connections to environmental testing and geological surveys for mining operations. Martha opened the journal again, her hands trembling slightly. Edgar documented payments to at least 6 other consultants, if your theory is correct. Then your great-uncle wasn't just hiding evidence, Chen finished. He was hiding from the same people who've been systematically eliminating anyone who knew the truth about Copper Creek. She looked directly at Harold. And now that you've inherited his legacy, you're next on their list. The weight of their situation crashed down on Harold like the mine collapse that had started it all 40 years ago. The blizzard had been raging for 3 hours when Martha noticed the footprints circling the lodge. She pressed her face against the frost-covered window, her breath fogging the glass as she traced the deliberate pattern with her finger. Someone had been walking around their sanctuary, testing every entrance, every weakness. "Harold," she whispered, not wanting to wake the others sleeping in the main room. "Come look at this." Harold shuffled over, his arthritic joints protesting after hours huddled by the dying fire. The footprints were already being covered by fresh snow, but the intent was unmistakable. Multiple sets moving in coordinated sweeps around the building. "They found us," he said quietly, "even in this storm." Through the howling wind, they heard the subtle sound of wood creaking, not the natural settling of an old building, but the deliberate pressure of someone testing the back door. Martha's heart hammered as she remembered the hidden safe they'd discovered earlier, its contents still spread across the kitchen table like evidence of crimes they barely understood. The photographs, the bank documents, the names of people who should have been long dead, all of it painted a picture of something far larger than a simple inheritance. Harold had spent the evenings studying the papers while Martha tried to make sense of their situation. They weren't just inheritors, they were witnesses to something that had been carefully buried for decades. A soft thud from upstairs made them both freeze. Someone was on the roof. "The chimney," Harold breathed. "They're coming down the chimney." Martha grabbed the poker from beside the fireplace, her hands shaking not from cold, but from a fury she hadn't felt in years. These people, whoever they were, had already taken so much from them. Their children, their dignity, their peaceful retirement. She wouldn't let them take their lives too. Harold moved with surprising speed for a man his age, gathering the documents from the table and stuffing them into the old leather satchel they'd found with the safe. The sound from above grew louder, boots scraping against brick, equipment being lowered. "Wake the others," Martha hissed, but Harold was already shaking Thomas awake. The younger man, though younger was relative when you were in your 70s, had been their unexpected ally since arriving at the lodge. His knowledge of the mountains and survival skills had already saved them once. Sarah stirred as Thomas bolted upright, instantly alert. She'd been the most skeptical of their group initially, but finding her own name in those documents had changed everything. Her late husband's accident 20 years ago suddenly seemed far more sinister. "How many?" Thomas asked, reaching for the hunting rifle he'd kept close since their arrival. "At least 3 sets of prints," Harold reported. "One on the roof, probably more at the exits." The sound of the fire being smothered from above confirmed their worst fears. Smoke began backing up into the room, and they heard the unmistakable whisper of rope being deployed down the chimney. "The tunnels," Sarah said suddenly. "Thomas, You said there were old mining tunnels beneath the lodge. Thomas nodded grimly. But they're dangerous, half-collapsed, unmapped. We could get lost down there and freeze to death. Better than the alternative, Martha said, surprising herself with the steel in her voice. A shadow dropped into the fireplace, black-clad, professional, moving with deadly precision. Thomas raised his rifle, but the figure was already rolling away from the hearth, and suddenly the room exploded into chaos. Harold tackled Martha to the floor as bullets shattered the windows. The bitter mountain wind roared into the room, extinguishing their remaining light sources and plunging them into near darkness. Emergency lighting clicked on. Their pursuers were using night vision equipment. "Basement!" Thomas shouted over the gunfire. "There's a trapdoor behind the furnace." They scrambled across the floor, staying low as more figures poured through the windows. Martha clutched the satchel of documents, knowing instinctively that these papers were worth more than their lives to someone. The question was who, and why now, after all these years? The basement was a maze of shadows and forgotten storage. Thomas led them past old furniture and mouldering supplies to a corner where decades of dust had accumulated over a wooden panel set into the floor. He hauled it open to reveal a black hole disappearing into the mountain's depths. "I'll go first," he said, swinging his legs over the edge. "It's about a 6-foot drop to the tunnel floor." The sound of boots on the stairs above spurred them into action. Sarah went next, then Harold, leaving Martha alone as footsteps thundered overhead. She looked back once at the lodge that had promised them sanctuary, then dropped into the darkness below. The tunnel was narrower than she'd expected, barely wide enough for 2 people. The air smelled of earth and old decay, and somewhere in the distance, water dripped with metronomic persistence. Behind them, flashlight beams probed the basement, and angry voices echoed their frustration. They had minutes, maybe less, before pursuit followed them into the mountain's belly. But as they stumbled forward into the absolute darkness, Martha realized they'd traded one trap for another. The grandfather clock in the lodge's main hall chimed midnight as Harold crept down the darkened staircase, his arthritic joints protesting each careful step. Martha had been asleep for an hour, exhausted from their harrowing escape through the mountain tunnels earlier that day. But sleep eluded Harold as questions gnawed at his mind like persistent termites. The leather-bound journal they'd discovered in the hidden vault lay heavy in his trembling hands. Eleanor Blackwood's meticulous handwriting had revealed devastating truths about the Meridian Corporation's decades-long conspiracy, but Harold sensed they'd only scratched the surface. The deeper he read, the more convinced he became that their mysterious benefactor, the one who'd orchestrated their inheritance, had left them more than just property deeds and bank statements. Moonlight streamed through the tall windows, casting eerie shadows across the lodge's rustic interior. Harold settled into the leather armchair by the dying fireplace and opened the journal to where he'd left off. Eleanor's words seemed to whisper from the pages like voices from beyond the grave. The children never knew about the photographs. How could I tell them their father wasn't the war hero they believed him to be, that Thomas Meridian had orchestrated the attack that killed 17 innocent people, including his own business partner, just to claim the mining rights? The evidence is hidden where only family blood can find it. Harold's breath caught in his throat. Family blood. He fumbled for his reading glasses and reread the passage. Throughout the journal, Eleanor had made cryptic references to bloodlines and inheritance, but he'd assumed she meant financial legacy. Now, in the dim firelight, another possibility emerged. A soft creak from the kitchen made him freeze. Harold closed the journal and listened intently. The lodge seemed to breathe around him, old timbers settling in the mountain cold. But there, another sound, deliberate footsteps. "Martha?" he whispered, but received no response. Harold's pulse quickened as he remembered Agent Morrison's warning about Meridian operatives still hunting them. He clutched the journal to his chest and considered his options. The front door was 20 feet away, but the floorboards would announce his movement. The back exit led through the kitchen, directly toward the sounds he'd heard. A shadow passed by the kitchen doorway. Harold's military training from 5 decades ago kicked in. He slipped off his shoes and padded silently toward the staircase, intending to wake Martha and escape through the second-floor emergency exit they'd located earlier. But as he reached the bottom step, a familiar voice stopped him cold. "Hello, grandfather." Harold spun around to find his grandson David emerging from the kitchen, but this wasn't the sullen young man who'd dismissed him as a burden just weeks ago. David's eyes held a hardness that made Harold's blood run cold, and the pistol in his hand explained everything. "David, what are you doing here?" "I've been watching you for days," David said, his voice eerily calm. "Quite impressive for an old man, really. All that running around in tunnels playing detective. But it's time to stop." The journal felt like lead in Harold's hands. "You're working for them, for Meridian." David smiled, but it held no warmth. "Working for them? Grandfather, I am them. 3rd generation, actually. Did you really think it was coincidence that your children all abandoned you at the same time, that you received that mysterious inheritance right when you needed it most?" The pieces clicked together with sickening clarity. The nursing home recommendations, the sudden coldness from his own children, the perfectly timed inheritance that had seemed like divine intervention. "You've been manipulating us from the beginning." Eleanor Blackwood was very clever, hiding her evidence and setting up that elaborate inheritance scheme. But she underestimated our reach. "We've been inside your family for 20 years, Harold. I've been reporting on you since I was 15. Harold's legs felt weak. "Your own grandparents?" "Nothing personal, but that journal contains information that could destroy a very profitable operation. Meridian didn't survive this long by allowing sentimental old people to play hero." Martha's scream shattered the night air from upstairs. Harold lurched toward the staircase, but David's voice stopped him. "She's fine, for now. My associates are simply ensuring she doesn't interfere. What do you want?" "The journal, and the location of Eleanor's final cache. We know she hid more than documents. There are photographs, recorded conversations, financial records going back to the 1960s. Tell us where they are, and Martha lives to see morning." Harold's mind raced. Eleanor's references to family blood suddenly made perfect sense. Not metaphorical heritage, but literal DNA. Somewhere in this lodge was a biometric lock that only Eleanor's descendants could access. And despite David's betrayal, the young man's blood still carried the Blackwood line through Harold's late wife's genealogy. Harold looked at his grandson, this stranger wearing a familiar face, and realized their deadly game was far from over. "I'll need the journal to remember Eleanor's clues," Harold said carefully. David's smile widened. "I thought you might see reason." The photograph trembled in Martha's weathered hands as she stared at the face that had haunted her dreams for 40 years. Thomas Blackwood smiled back at her from the faded image, his arm around a woman Martha had never seen before, standing in front of the very lodge where she and Harold now sat. "That's impossible," Harold whispered, leaning closer to examine the picture. "Thomas died in Korea. We went to his funeral." Martha's mind raced back to that grey December morning in 1953, the folded flag, the empty casket they said contained her brother's remains. She remembered holding her mother's hand as they lowered it into the frozen ground, how her father never spoke Thomas's name again. "Look at the date on the back," she said, her voice barely audible. Harold turned the photograph over. Written in familiar handwriting were the words, "Helen and me, Christmas 1955. Finally found our sanctuary." The room seemed to spin around Martha. Her brother had been alive 2 years after his supposed death, living in this remote mountain hideaway with a woman named Helen. But why the deception? Why let his family mourn him while he started a new life? A leather-bound journal lay open beside the photograph on the desk. Harold picked it up with shaking fingers and began to read aloud. "December 25th, 1955. Another peaceful Christmas at the lodge. Helen made her famous apple pie, and we watched the snow fall over the valley. Sometimes I wonder if we made the right choice, disappearing like we did. But then I remember what they wanted us to do with the research. Some knowledge is too dangerous to exist. Martha felt the blood drain from her face. What research? Thomas was just a soldier. Harold continued reading. The atomic energy experiments at Los Alamos opened doors that should have stayed closed. When Helen and I discovered what the government planned to do with our work on uranium enrichment, we knew we had to vanish. They told my family I died in Korea to stop them from looking for me. It was the only way to protect everyone I loved. The pieces began falling into place with horrifying clarity. Thomas hadn't been just any soldier. He'd been a scientist, recruited for his brilliance and sworn to secrecy. Whatever he and Helen had discovered was valuable enough that powerful people had faked his death to keep it hidden. "There's more," Harold said, flipping through pages filled with equations and diagrams that neither of them could understand. "Listen to this. Hidden the fortune in the place only family would think to look. If something happens to us, I pray Martha will be smart enough to find it and wise enough to use it carefully. The combination is her birth year, mother's maiden name, and the number of steps from the front door to the old oak tree." Martha's heart pounded as she remembered the heavy safe they'd discovered in the basement. She'd assumed it was empty, but now, "We have to go downstairs. Now." They descended into the musty basement, Martha counting under her breath as she recalled the layout upstairs. 47 steps from the front door to the oak tree. Her birth year was 1925. Her mother's maiden name was Garrett. The safe sat in the corner like a sleeping giant, its combination lock reflecting the bare bulb overhead. With trembling fingers, Martha began turning the dial. 1925. Garrett. The safe opened with a heavy clunk that echoed through the basement. Inside, stacks of bearer bonds filled one shelf, more money than Martha had ever seen in her life. But it was the manila envelope marked insurance that made Harold's face go pale. He pulled out photographs of men in expensive suits, documents stamped classified, and a letter addressed to whoever finds this first. "My dear Martha," Harold read, his voice shaking. "If you're reading this, then Helen and I are gone, and the people we've been hiding from have finally found us. The bonds are yours, our family's compensation for the years of lies and the danger we brought to your door. But the real treasure is the formula Helen perfected. It could revolutionize energy production or destroy the world, depending on whose hands it falls into." A sudden sound from upstairs made them both freeze. Footsteps crossed the floor above, slow and deliberate. Martha grabbed the envelope while Harold stuffed the bonds into his coat. They weren't alone anymore. "We know you're down there," a voice called from the top of the basement stairs. "Thomas left us quite a trail to follow. 40 years is a long time to wait, but some prizes are worth the patience." Martha looked at her husband and saw her own terror reflected in his eyes. They'd found the truth about Thomas, but now they understood why he'd spent his life running. The same people who'd faked his death had finally come to collect what they believed was theirs, and Martha and Harold were trapped in the basement with nowhere left to run. The storm had passed, but the silence that followed felt more ominous than the howling wind. Harold pressed his eye to the crack in the boarded window, watching 3 black SUVs navigate the winding mountain road toward the lodge. Steam rose from their hoods in the frigid morning air. "They found us," he whispered to Martha, who was frantically stuffing documents from Eleanor's hidden safe into a canvas bag. Her hands trembled as she worked, but her movements were efficient and determined. "How long do we have?" she asked without looking up. 5 minutes, maybe less." The previous night's discovery had changed everything. Behind the false back of Eleanor's bedroom closet, they'd found not just documents, but photographs spanning 40 years. Pictures of their mysterious benefactor with government officials, mining executives, and men in expensive suits whose faces Harold recognized from newspaper obituaries. Eleanor hadn't been just a witness to the conspiracy. She'd been documenting it, building a case that could topple an empire built on murder and stolen land. The lodge sat atop one of the largest untapped lithium deposits in North America. The same mineral now powering everything from cell phones to electric cars had been known about since the 1980s, but a small group of investors had systematically eliminated anyone who threatened their plan to extract it quietly, without government oversight or environmental protection. Eleanor's husband had been the geologist who discovered the deposit. His death in that supposed hunting accident had been the first murder, but far from the last. "The back exit," Harold said, shouldering the canvas bag while Martha grabbed the metal box containing the most damning evidence. "Through the kitchen." They moved as quietly as their 70-year-old joints would allow, but every creak of the old floorboards sounded like a gunshot to Harold's ears. Behind them, car doors slammed in the front courtyard. The kitchen door opened onto a narrow path that led down the mountain through thick pine forest. They discovered it 2 days ago during their exploration of the property. Now it might be their only chance at survival. Martha stumbled on a root, and Harold caught her arm. "I'm okay," she gasped, but he could see the exhaustion in her face. They'd been running on adrenaline and determination for days, and the stress was taking its toll. A window shattered behind them, followed by the sound of heavy boots on wooden floors. Harold pulled Martha deeper into the trees, grateful for the thick canopy that blocked most of the morning light. The semi-darkness would help conceal them, but it also made the treacherous path more dangerous. "Harold." Martha's voice was barely a whisper. "The car keys." His blood turned to ice. They'd left their rental car parked beside the lodge, keys sitting on Eleanor's kitchen counter. There was no going back for them now. Voices echoed through the forest, multiple men spreading out to search. Harold recognized the clipped, military precision of their coordination. These weren't local thugs or hired muscle, they were professionals. They pressed on, following the path as it wound downward through increasingly dense undergrowth. Harold's lungs burned, and his knees screamed with each careful step. Beside him, Martha maintained her determined pace, but he could hear her labored breathing. A branch snapped somewhere behind them, too close for comfort. The path opened into a small clearing where an old hunting cabin leaned against a massive boulder. Its roof had partially collapsed, and vines covered most of its walls, but Harold spotted something that made his heart leap. A rusted pickup truck parked behind the structure. "Do you think it runs?" Martha whispered. Harold was already moving toward it, praying silently. The truck was old, probably from the 1990s, but mountain vehicles were built to last. He tried the door handle and found it unlocked. No keys in the ignition. He dropped to his knees and felt under the front bumper, then along the wheel wells. Mountain folk often hid spare keys on their vehicles. His fingers found a magnetic box attached to the undercarriage. The key inside was corroded, but intact. Martha was already in the passenger seat when Harold slid behind the wheel. The engine turned over once, twice, then caught with a rumbling cough that seemed impossibly loud in the morning stillness. Shouts erupted from the forest above them as their pursuers heard the engine. Harold threw the truck into gear and pressed the accelerator, sending them lurching down an overgrown logging road he hoped led to the main highway. Branches scraped against the windows as they bounced through ruts and over fallen logs. In the rearview mirror, Harold caught glimpses of men in dark clothing pursuing them on foot, but the truck was pulling away. "Where are we going?" Martha asked, clutching the evidence box against her chest. Harold's jaw was set with grim determination. To finish what Eleanor started. The old pickup truck disappeared around a bend in the road, carrying them toward an uncertain future and the most dangerous gamble of their lives. The sound of helicopter rotors cut through the mountain air like a death knell. Harold pressed himself against the cold stone wall of the cave entrance, his arthritic hands trembling as he clutched the leather portfolio containing decades of incriminating documents. Martha crouched beside him, her breath coming in sharp puffs that crystallized in the frigid air. "They found us," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the growing thunder of the approaching aircraft. Through the narrow opening, Harold could see the black helicopter circling the lodge below like a vulture. 3 more vehicles snaked up the mountain road, their headlights cutting swaths through the gathering dusk. The Blackwood Foundation had mobilized everything. "The back tunnel," Harold said, remembering the hand-drawn map they'd discovered in Uncle Edgar's journal. Edgar wrote about an old mining shaft that connects to the railway line. Martha nodded, though her face was pale with exhaustion. They'd been running for 6 hours, ever since discovering the hidden vault beneath the lodge's foundation, the vault that contained not just Edgar's fortune, but evidence of murders, cover-ups and corruption stretching back to the 1960s, evidence that powerful men had killed to protect. They moved deeper into the cave system, Harold's flashlight beam dancing across walls carved by decades of water erosion. The temperature dropped with each step, and Martha's labored breathing echoed off the stone. Harold's chest tightened with worry. At their age, this kind of physical stress was dangerous, but stopping meant certain death. "Harold," Martha gasped, leaning against a rocky outcrop. "I can't. I need a moment." He wrapped his arm around her shoulders, feeling how fragile she'd become. When had his strong, determined wife grown so thin? When had her hands become so cold? "We're almost there," he lied, having no idea how far the tunnel extended. "Just a little further." A distant shout echoed from the cave entrance behind them. Flashlight beams pierced the darkness, followed by the scrape of boots on stone. The hunters had become the hunted. "Move," Harold urged, half carrying Martha deeper into the mountain's bowels. The tunnel branched ahead. Harold chose the left passage, following the faint current of air that suggested an opening somewhere ahead. Behind them, voices grew louder, more urgent. Someone barked orders about containing the situation and eliminating witnesses. Martha stumbled, her knees hitting the rocky floor hard. Harold heard her sharp intake of breath, saw the dark stain spreading across her pants leg. "I'm slowing you down," she said, struggling to stand. "Take the documents and go." "Absolutely not." Harold's voice carried a steel she hadn't heard in years. 62 years of marriage, Martha. I'm not leaving you now." He helped her to her feet, noting how she favored her injured leg. They pressed on, Harold's flashlight revealing ancient railway ties embedded in the tunnel floor. Edgar's map had been accurate. The sound of pursuit grew closer. Harold could hear individual voices now, could make out fragments of radio chatter, professional killers, closing in methodically. There, Martha pointed ahead with a shaking finger. A rust-covered metal door stood partially ajar, revealing tracks that disappeared into another tunnel. Harold pushed it open, wincing at the screech of corroded hinges. Beyond lay the old railway line, unused for decades but still intact. They emerged onto a narrow ledge carved into the mountainside. Far below, lights twinkled in the valley. The railway tracks stretched along the cliff face, supported by wooden trestle bridges that looked questionably stable. "The maintenance shed," Harold said, spotting a small structure a quarter-mile down the track. "We can hide there. Try to contact the authorities." "Harold." Martha's voice was strange, distant. "Look." He followed her gaze back toward the tunnel entrance. A figure stood silhouetted against the darkness, tall and imposing. The man stepped forward, and Harold's blood turned to ice. "Detective Morrison?" he called out, confusion evident in his voice. The detective who had promised to help them, who had taken their statement about the conspiracy, stepped into the moonlight. In his hand was a service revolver, pointed directly at them. "I'm sorry, Harold." Martha Morrison's voice carried what might have been genuine regret. "I tried to convince them to let you walk away, but you found too much. You know too much. You're one of them," Martha said, her voice flat with the weight of betrayal. "My father worked for Blackwood Industries. So did my grandfather. The foundation has been very good to my family." Morrison stepped closer, his weapon steady. "Hand over the documents and I'll make this quick. You won't suffer." Harold clutched the portfolio tighter. Inside were photographs of murders, Financial records showing decades of stolen funds, correspondence proving that senators and judges had been bought, evidence that could topple an empire built on blood and corruption. "No," he said simply. Morrison raised his weapon. "Then I'm truly sorry." The crack of gunfire echoed across the mountain, followed by screams that shattered the night silence. The morning sun cast long shadows through the lodge windows as Harold methodically loaded the last of the evidence boxes into their rental car. His hands, steadier now than they'd been in weeks, carefully arranged the documents that would bring down the Blackwater Consortium. Martha emerged from the lodge carrying a thermos of coffee and the encrypted laptop they'd found in Edmund's hidden safe. "The FBI field office in Denver confirmed they're sending a full team," she said, handing Harold the coffee. Agent Morrison sounded like she'd been waiting her whole career for something like this. Harold nodded, though his eyes kept scanning the tree line. The consortium had been silent for too long. After the failed attack 3 nights ago, he'd expected retaliation, but the mountain had remained eerily quiet. It felt like the calm before a storm he couldn't yet see forming. "We should have left yesterday," Martha murmured, voicing the same unease that had been gnawing at him. "Every hour we stay here makes us sitting ducks." As if summoned by her words, the distant sound of helicopter rotors echoed off the mountain walls. Harold's blood chilled. The nearest ranger station was 30 miles away, and they hadn't called for any emergency services. "Get in the car," he said quietly, his voice carrying the authority he'd once wielded in boardrooms decades ago. "Now." Martha didn't argue. She dove into the passenger seat as Harold gunned the engine, gravel spraying as they accelerated down the winding mountain road. Through the rearview mirror, he watched 2 black helicopters crest the ridge behind them, moving with military precision. The road twisted through dense forest, each curve potentially hiding an ambush. Harold pushed the rental car harder than it was designed for, the engine whining in protest as they descended the mountain face. The helicopters maintained their distance, but he could see armed figures silhouetted against the aircraft windows. There, Martha pointed ahead to where a convoy of black SUVs had blocked the road at a hairpin turn. "They're hurting us." Harold's mind raced through their options. Behind them, the helicopters were closing in. Ahead, at least 6 armed men had taken positions behind their vehicles. The forest pressed in on both sides, too dense for the car to penetrate. "The old mining road," Harold said suddenly, remembering something from Edmund's journals. "Quarter mile ahead, there should be a service track that connects to the abandoned copper mine." He spotted the overgrown entrance almost too late, yanking the wheel hard right just as gunfire erupted from the roadblock behind them. The car bucked and lurched over rocks and fallen branches, the undercarriage scraping against granite outcroppings as they climbed the forgotten trail. The helicopters couldn't follow them under the forest canopy, but Harold knew they'd radio ground teams to intercept them wherever this path led. The mining road was barely wide enough for their car, forcing them to crawl around massive boulders and navigate washouts where decades of spring runoff had carved deep channels. "Harold, look." Martha's voice was tight with fear. Ahead, the trees opened into a clearing where the abandoned mine complex sat like a monument to industrial ambition. Rusted equipment and collapsed wooden structures littered the area, but what captured Harold's attention was the helicopter already landed in the center of the clearing, its rotors still spinning lazily. A figure emerged from behind the aircraft, and Harold's heart sank as he recognized the silver-haired man from the photograph in Edmund's files. Thomas Blackwater himself had come to finish this personally. "End of the line," Harold muttered, but his hand was already reaching for the emergency bag Martha had prepared. Inside were flares, a satellite phone, and the backup drive containing copies of all their evidence. "We don't have to make this easy for them," Martha said, surprising him with the steel in her voice. She held up the laptop they'd found in Edmund's safe. "This has everything. Financial records, assassination orders, names of every politician and judge they've bought over the past 40 years. If we can transmit even half of this data." The satellite phone crackled to life in Harold's hands. Agent Morrison's voice came through clearly despite the mountain terrain. "Harold, we're tracking multiple aircraft converging on your position. Ground teams are en route, but they're still 20 minutes out." "We might not have 20 minutes, Harold replied, watching as armed figures spread out from behind the helicopter. "I'm uploading files to the Federal Evidence Server now. If something happens to us, the access codes are in Martha's purse." Harold looked at Martha, seeing his own resolve reflected in her determined expression. They'd spent their whole lives being careful, being reasonable, being forgotten. Not today. The morning sun cast long shadows across the lodge's wraparound porch as Harold finished loading the last of the evidence boxes into Sheriff Davidson's truck. Martha stood beside him, clutching the leather journal that had started their terrifying journey just 3 weeks ago. It felt like a lifetime. "You sure you two want to stay up here another night?" Davidson asked, adjusting his hat against the mountain breeze. "Those federal agents won't arrive until tomorrow afternoon, and after what happened with Blackwood's people—" "We'll be fine," Harold said, though his bandaged shoulder throbbed as a reminder of how close they'd come to losing everything. "Besides, someone needs to keep an eye on the place." Martha smiled at her husband's understated courage. The man, who'd once been afraid to argue with a grocery store clerk, had faced down armed killers to protect their newfound legacy. She squeezed his uninjured arm. Davidson nodded and climbed into his truck. "I'll have a deputy patrol the access road every few hours. Call if you need anything." The engine rumbled to life, and gravel crunched under the tires as he drove away, taking with him decades of evidence that would finally bring justice to those who'd tried to bury the truth. As the sound faded into the mountain silence, Harold and Martha found themselves alone at the lodge for the first time since discovering its secrets. The morning felt surreal after the violence of the past few days. Blood had been scrubbed from the great room's hardwood floors, but Harold could still see the stains in his mind. "Hard to believe it's over," Martha said, settling into one of the porch rockers that had belonged to Harold's Uncle Edmund. Harold eased into the chair beside her, wincing slightly. "Is it, though? There's still the trial, the media attention, figuring out what to do with all of Edmund's assets. Those are good problems to have." Martha opened the journal, its pages now familiar after countless readings. "Listen to this entry I missed before." She found the passage and read aloud. "The greatest treasure isn't the gold or the documents, or even the justice they might bring. It's having someone who believes in you when the world says you're worthless." Harold felt his throat tighten. Their own children's cruel words still echoed sometimes. "Too old, too set in your ways, too much trouble." But Edmund's inheritance had given them more than money or purpose. It had reminded them who they really were. "He knew," Martha continued. "Edmund knew we'd been forgotten by our own family. That's why he left this to us." A hawk circled overhead, riding the mountain thermals. Harold watched it soar and thought about the Blackwood Corporation executives who were probably in federal custody by now. Their empire, built on stolen resources and covered-up murders, was crumbling, all because an elderly couple had refused to be intimidated. "Do you think we'll hear from the kids?" Martha asked. "When this hits the news." Harold considered this. Their daughter Sarah and son Michael had cut off contact months ago, too busy with their own lives to bother with aging parents. Now those same parents were inheriting millions and exposing a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of corporate power. "Probably," he said, "but not for the right reasons." Martha nodded sadly. Money has a way of changing people's memories about family obligations. They rocked in comfortable silence, watching the mountains stretch endlessly toward the horizon. Somewhere down there, the world continued spinning with its deadlines and traffic and endless rush toward nowhere. But up here, time moved differently. "I have an idea about the foundation," Martha said eventually. "Edmund's foundation for exposing corporate corruption." "What's that?" "What if we specifically help older people who've been pushed aside? Folks like us who everyone assumes don't matter anymore." Her eyes sparked with the same fire Harold had fallen in love with 50 years ago. "We could give them resources, legal support, a platform to fight back." Harold smiled. "I like that. Show the world that being old doesn't mean being powerless. A movement in the tree line caught Harold's attention. For a moment, his muscles tensed, but it was only a deer emerging to graze in the meadow. The danger was truly over. You know what I realized? Martha closed the journal and looked at her husband. We spent so much energy trying to stay relevant to our children, trying to prove we still mattered. But we always mattered. We just forgot. Harold reached over and took her hand. Her wedding ring, worn thin after 5 decades, caught the sunlight. Think we can handle being rich troublemakers? Martha laughed, the sound echoing across the mountains. Harold, we just took down $1 billion corporation and survived multiple assassination attempts. I think we can handle anything. As the sun climbed higher, they continued rocking, planning their new life as guardians of Edmund's legacy and champions for the forgotten. The inheritance had given them wealth, but more importantly, it had given them back their purpose. The morning sun cast long shadows across the valley as Harold and Martha stood on the lodge's wraparound porch, watching the last of the FBI vehicles disappear down the winding mountain road. Agent Chen had promised them updates, but for now they were alone with their thoughts and the weight of everything they'd discovered. Hard to believe it's over, Martha said, her fingers intertwined with Harold's weathered hand. Is it, though? Harold adjusted his glasses, studying the forest that had hidden so many secrets. The consortium's leaders are in custody, but something this big. There have to be loose ends. Martha nodded, understanding his caution. They'd learned not to trust easy answers. What do we do now? Before Harold could respond, his phone buzzed. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize, but something made him answer. Dad? The voice was tentative, almost fragile. Harold's breath caught. David. I saw the news. About the arrests, the conspiracy. They mentioned your names. Their son's voice cracked slightly. Are you both okay? Martha moved closer, and Harold tilted the phone so she could hear. We're fine, Harold said carefully. Surprised to hear from you. I know I don't have the right to call, not after how we treated you. David's words came in a rush. But seeing your faces on the news, knowing you were in danger... God, Dad, what if something had happened and the last thing I said to you was that you were a burden? Martha's eyes filled with tears, but she remained silent. Your mother and I made our peace with your decision, Harold said, though his voice betrayed the pain those words had caused. No, you didn't. You shouldn't have to. David's breathing was shaky. Jennifer and we talked all night. We were wrong. So wrong. We let fear of responsibility, of inconvenience, override everything you taught us about family. Harold looked at Martha, seeing his own conflicted emotions reflected in her face. The hurt was still there, but so was the love that decades of parenthood had built. Fear makes people do things they regret, Martha said gently, speaking into the phone. We know something about that now. Mom? David's voice broke completely. I'm so sorry, both of us. Jennifer wants to talk to you too when you're ready. We want to make this right if you'll let us. Harold walked to the porch railing, Martha beside him. Below, the mountain stream that had led them to the truth sparkled in the morning light. They'd come so close to losing everything, their lives, their love, their chance at redemption. The inheritance had given them far more than money. It had given them a second chance at life itself. Your mother and I aren't the same people we were a month ago, Harold said. We've learned we're stronger than we thought, more capable. We don't need anyone to take care of us. I know, David said quickly. That's not what I meant. Let me finish. Harold's voice was firm but not unkind. We don't need you to take care of us, but we'd like you to be part of our lives again. If you want that too. The silence stretched for a long moment before David answered. More than anything. Then we'll figure it out, Martha said, one step at a time. After they hung up, Harold and Martha sat on the porch swing they'd grown to love. The lodge would always be theirs now. Agent Chen had confirmed that the inheritance was legitimate, that Eleanor's grandfather had indeed meant for it to find its way to family, even distant family he'd never met. Think we can trust them? Martha asked. The kids, I mean, that they've really changed? I think we've all changed. Harold pulled her closer. Besides, we're not the helpless old couple they abandoned. We're the couple who took down a criminal conspiracy. Martha laughed, the sound carrying across the mountain air. When you put it like that. We'll set boundaries, Harold continued. Make it clear that we're choosing to rebuild this relationship, not accepting charity or pity. And if it doesn't work out? Harold looked around at the lodge, at the mountains, at the life they'd discovered they could still build. Then we have this. We have each other. We have more money than we could spend in 10 lifetimes, and we've proven we can handle whatever life throws at us. Martha squeezed his hand. So what's next? Harold smiled, thinking of all the possibilities that lay before them. Travel, if they wanted, philanthropy, maybe even reaching out to other distant relatives who might exist somewhere in the world. The inheritance had taught them that family could be found in the most unexpected places. Next, he said, we live, really live. We've earned that right. As if in agreement, the mountain wind picked up, rustling through the trees that had witnessed so much history, so much pain, and now, finally, so much hope.